Bonk. All right, so Dan was asking me some interesting questions on Slack, and I asked him to just go ahead and ask them again in a call real quick because they were good questions, and I figured it's best to actually, have a recording of this so we can write it down, we can document it, and until we do that, other people can actually get good questions answered. So
Yeah.
Dan, feel free.
Cool. So I guess one of the questions I had is in a typical HA setup that we do for GitLab, and like AWS or Azure or GCP, we end up separating the Gitaly node out and having Gitaly become its own server, and then basically have the app server making calls to Gitaly. Is that so? In a Kubernetes environment, is the same thing happening where Gitaly is in a separate pod, or is Gitaly on the same pod with the application services like Unicorn and everything else?
So I'll correlate two things. First, the omnibus itself, even when you have it on a single node, it's still running Gitaly as a service because the application is actually dependent on that. The only difference is at scale, when you start to need more front-end nodes and you need to maybe shard your storage, that's when you actually fully separate Gitaly. Because if you need more than one API front-end or a Sidekick worker, you'd rather not have them need to be on the same node. Whether you actually have one machine that has no sidekicks on it but has Unicorn and Gitaly, and then all the sidekicks are remote, those sidekicks are still talking back to that omnibus node. So when you do it in quote HA or production on AWS, where you have multiple points and nodes and storage, you're still doing the exact same thing you did before. The only difference is now you have nodes that are dedicated to doing Gitaly. When we do this in the charts, it's specifically designed in such a way that every component is actually a separate pod. So whether you've got Unicorn and Workhorse in one pod, Sidekick off doing its thing in another series of pods, or the registry running out in yet another series of pods, the Gitaly service is done in what we call a stateful set. So you can have sharded sets of it, but you will always have at least one specifically named Gitaly until such time as we get HA for Gitaly. That then binds specifically to the disk, and then all the pods that need to speak to Gitaly do so within the cluster's container networking. So you get, by default, one Gitaly node one Gitaly pod that has a named disk that it and only it will ever be able to claim. So even if you add another one, you don't have to worry about them claiming the same disk.
Yep, that makes sense. So then is it just using like a persistent value claim? Like you create a persistent value in Kubernetes, and then you use a persistent value claim to claim that value, and then is that worth this? That's where everything's being stored, correct?
Effectively, yes. There's some complexities of how stateful sets work, and I'll leave that to looking up the documentation for Kubernetes. But yes, essentially we go, hey, you've asked for one Gitaly node named default, and that's the first one, so we're going to call this disk Gitaly 0. And then we go, the first one will always get Gitaly 0's PVC.
Right, that makes sense. Another question that I had was, is there a reason you'd want to use Minio over something like an S3 bucket or GCP cloud storage or something for object storage?
Okay, so let me first state, if you're actually going to use Minio in production, consider what you're doing, please. Okay, we provide Minio as an out-of-the-box way to actually test it or to do it in Minikube so that you actually have a functional deployment. If you're going to use the charts in real production, in a public cloud or a private cloud, your state should not be a part of that chart at this time. Okay, so use an external provider for object storage, whether that's S3, GCP, DigitalOcean Spaces, Azure, I don't care, but Minio, the chart as it is not included and designed to be an HA resilient item that can handle failures, right? It's functional. It will rarely lose any data, and I say very rarely at that point. However, if this is your production data, do not rely on that component. We've actually been calling that out that you should put your database in a proper managed provider. You should put your file system in a proper managed provider. You should put your object storage in a proper managed provider, right? The charts are the application and the application suite components. We provide everything that's necessary to have a functional chart out of the box. That does not mean that we provide production grade HA massively resilient services out of the box. The reason being is straightforward. Postgres, at the time we started our work, so keep in mind this is nigh 2 years ago, did not have a good, resilient performance Kubernetes implementation, because it's really hard to do state in a stateless platform. That has changed since then, keeping in mind that we started at like Kubernetes 1.7 and we're now at Kubernetes 1.14, right? So significant gains have happened in that time. We're looking to add the ability to do good quality HA Postgres and good quality HA Redis in the future. We're going to try and get some of that in for the 12.0 release, but there are steps that have to be taken to get all of that in and tested and confirmed. In the meantime, there's really good providers for these things, and if you want to run in production, these things should not be in the chart.
Yeah, so that was going to bring me to my next question. So you recommend leveraging outside services like in AWS's case, like RDS and Elasticache for Redis. Is that so? That's what you recommend for the most part, then?
We have recommended that since day one. If
Cool.
you're going to do it in production, get resilience through a good quality managed service provider. Or if you're doing this on-prem and you don't already have object storage, you should find someone to provide you good quality object storage. But if you don't have some team that's already managing your databases or your Redises, we have the ability to do Postgres HA with the Omnibus, and you can actually stand up a database cluster with Omnibus and or stand up a Redis cluster with Omnibus and then point the charts at that. That is completely doable as of today.
That's awesome.
Hey, Jason, I have a quick question.
I heard you until your mic cut out.
Yeah, his mic cut out for me too.
Chris? Maybe, Dan, what's that short key you guys use on Mac?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. My headset automatically switched to something else. So you mentioned Minio not being used in production, right? So what if they, is that in terms of the charts, or is that just in terms of Minio in general? Like if we have a client that has Minio that's set up on a production cluster, should we still not use it?
No, it's just the one that comes with our chart.
Okay.
There have been a lot of evolutions and changes in the upstream chart that actually begins to have the ability to do clustering and HA with the Minio code base itself. The chart that we include does not have this functionality built in.
Okay. So if they have something like Minio out of the box or something, it's okay to use it as long as they already have it set up, it's HA provisioned, etc. We just don't want them using our Minio charts for production.
Right on the button. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, that just confused me a little bit because I've seen Minio in production and you mentioned it. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So
yeah,
cool.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like totally use Postgres in production, just not our chart, right?
I mean,
so, Minio is a very good, very viable option. It's well run, battle tested, and included in many corporate products. Okay, it's there, it's good, just not designed for the chart that we currently include.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, that was the only thing I wanted the clarification on. Thanks.
No, that's perfectly good. That's 100%. I'm with you there.
I think that's it for questions for me. Are there any other general guidance notes that you think we should be aware of when using the Helm chart to install GitLab?
The biggest thing is people are confused on exactly how Let's Encrypt works and whether or not you can use like example.com Believe it or not, we've had a lot of people try and deploy the charts with the default domains, which is example.com according to RFC. That will not work ever. Even if you use self-signed certificates and example.com, it will fail because there's no real DNS for example.com. If you're using Minikube and you edit your host file and example.com now points to your Minikube, you'll be lucky if that works because there's a lot of things you have to do to make that work. But if you ever try and deploy it into a real cluster, it's going to fail. You need to have an actual domain. You need to have a functional domain, especially if you're going to use Let's Encrypt, because Let's Encrypt's remote services have to actually reach back over HTTP directly to issue a certificate. That does change in the future because you can do DNS-01 validation, and newer versions of Cert Manager will support this. However, that still requires having valid DNS that you control to be able to work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I can't think of any other questions right now. Chris, did you have any other questions?
Nope. No, not at the moment. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. This was really helpful.
Yeah, not a problem. I'm glad I could try and clear some of those things up. And if you find any questions that aren't already clarified in the documentation, as always, feel free to reach out and or even raise an issue on it like, hey, by the way, how does this work? I say that specifically because, for example, the recommendation to use external services for state has actually been in the charts for some time. However, there are some questions on where that recommendation ended up. So we need to make sure that that's clear, that's obvious, and we don't have to answer it like 100 times for all of our customers. It should be right up front for them.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, well, then if there's no other questions, thanks for you guys' time. I'll get this uploaded here shortly, and we'll see what we can make sure gets written down.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jason.
Have a good day.